Good morning, graduates, family, faculty, and staff. I want to start with a profound thought. Each one of us is alive today only because every single one of our ancestors, since the beginning of life on Earth, survived long enough to reproduce. Think about that for a moment. If that bacteria that developed into our mitochondria 1.2 billion years ago had succumbed to a bad sunburn, or if any one of our early human ancestors over the last 100,000 generations had been eaten by a saber-toothed tiger, or simply lost their footing and fell off of a cliff before reproducing, you wouldn't be here today. But instead, your specific genes prevailed, having successfully survived the harsh gauntlet of life, defying overwhelming odds. Now, you might be reluctant to take credit for this because you didn't have to do anything but be born. But this is still something that should inspire awe. No matter how slow you feel before that first cup of coffee, or how long you spent looking for your hotel key card this morning, you carry around 23 pairs of chromosomes encoding a highly refined blueprint for life that has made you very well adapted for survival, especially when survival was about how efficiently you were able to collect basic resources like food, clean water, and shelter. But unlike your ancestors over hundreds of thousands of generations, including those who lived through the Great Depression just a few generations ago, your unique situation relieves you from worrying about these basic necessities, at least in the immediate future. Capitalism and relatively stable geopolitics have left us drowning in material goods and comforts. And even though tragedy still strikes, the level of security that we have today relative to our ancestors is unprecedented. While we shouldn't assume that this will always be the case, the biggest question that you have to answer in life is, what do you want to do with yourself now that your well-being and your survival no longer depend on your ability to collect basic resources? If it seems like a difficult question, the reason is because none of us is particularly well adapted, genetically speaking, to answer it. As evidence of this, look no further than the mental health challenges we face as a society that are associated with 24/7 Slack notifications, text alerts, and overflowing inboxes. The finding that most people fear public speaking more than death, and the feeling that the world might be changing just a little too quickly with no one really at the helm. As individuals, we have at our fingertips today more resources than the most powerful governments in the world had only a couple of decades ago. I'm referring to computational resources like Amazon Web Services and Google Cloud, artificial intelligence, which includes machine learning, advances in next-generation sequencing, widespread automation, improvements in materials and fabrication methods like 3D printing, and in genetic manipulation through tools like CRISPR-Cas. And one of the more remarkable things is that these tools, for the first time, are not just available to domain experts and to governments, but they're available to all of us. Software like Weka allows non-programmers with minimal scientific training to apply powerful machine learning algorithms to extract hidden insights from their data. Google's recent demo of their duplex virtual assistant gives us a taste of what advanced natural language processing capabilities can offer. Synthego, a California-based startup, is now selling made-to-order gene editing reagents that make it easy for anyone to add or subtract genetic material in an organism. They're increasingly taking on more and more of the scientific workflow, making it virtual, and giving the world access to a platform for execution of genetic engineering in an automated way, rapidly advancing drug discovery and enabling an entire community of do-it-yourself biohackers. Technological innovation has broken down barriers in a way that is almost unfathomable. If Pandora's box was cracked open last century, its door will be thrown off the hinges in the 21st century. Graduates, it is you who will ultimately decide if the future looks like an episode of the dystopian Black Mirror or a more utopian Star Trek Enterprise. If you're not yet convinced of the magnitude of the challenges that lie ahead, I'll give you an example. Today, it's routine for fertility clinics to help couples who are both carriers of a devastating heritable disease to have a disease-free child by doing what's called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, essentially combining sperm and eggs under a microscope to create embryos, growing several of the resulting embryos until they're just small clumps of cells, and then plucking out a cell from each embryo and sequencing all of the DNA. By sequencing the DNA, the clinic can determine whether a given embryo inherited 2 disease-free copies of a gene, one from each parent, or 1 or more diseased copies. By implanting only the embryos that inherited disease-free genes, this technique has allowed thousands of healthy babies to be born to high-risk parents, and these babies will have no chance of developing Huntington's disease, sickle cell anemia, cystic fibrosis, ALS, and tens of other genetic diseases during their lifetimes. To families that suffer from genetic disease, this technology is a godsend, relieving uncertainty and avoiding immense suffering. But what if, instead of screening embryos for inheritance of a disease gene, what if we screened and chose embryos that contain genes that conferred certain physical traits, like eye color, hair color, height, or the gender of the baby? A clinic could then implant embryos, and the embryos would possess traits desired by the parents. You might be surprised to learn that this practice is perfectly legal and is already happening today. If this bothers you, it's important to remember that any of these babies could have been born naturally to those parents. Using this technique, parents can't arbitrarily create future Olympic athletes or Einsteins. Parents can't give their kids these traits if they don't already have the required versions of the genes themselves. But all of that changed in 2012 when the first complete CRISPR-Cas gene editing system was discovered, allowing DNA to be added and removed from a genome with precision. Just last year, a lab at Oregon Health and Science University demonstrated the use of the technique on human embryos to correct a heritable heart condition, successfully correcting 67% of the embryos. Now, this was just an experiment, and these embryos were never implanted into a uterus, but it doesn't take a visionary to understand the implications. This technology will fundamentally change what it means to be human, because you no longer have to inherit your genes. While there are certainly safety concerns that remain, there no longer exists a technical barrier to editing a human embryo to confer traits like endurance, stronger bones, exceptional musculature, and lower requirements for daily sleep, as the genes involved in these processes are already well understood. The possibilities will only increase as we gain increased understanding of the genome. The lines will blur between disease correction and trait-focused enhancement, and the ethical issues will only compound. While editing an embryo will affect the germline, causing the genetic change to be heritable in all future generations, companies are already working on editing specific tissues after birth to make modifications that are non-heritable. Late last year, the successful restoration of insulin-producing cells in a mouse model of type 1 diabetes was demonstrated, showing the potential of the technology to correct disease in fully developed adults. The idea that the use of such technology might be controlled with legislation is probably wishful thinking. Few legislators possess the expertise to develop thoughtful legislation, and even if they did, medical tourism to less regulated countries is already widespread. Hundreds of millions of dollars of venture capital are already pouring into the space, and lobbyists are already working hard trying to forge the future in the vision of their employers. Graduates, your training at UT Austin has prepared you to meet just about any technical challenge. The hours of lectures, of labs, and of studying have prepared you well. But what you're about to find out is that the technical challenges are some of the easiest ones that you'll solve in life. Now, they're not easy, but you've been trained to solve them. I encourage you to go out of your way to think about ethical challenges as well, because your expertise gives you one of the most meaningful perspectives to add to the discussion. And without you, who's at the helm? Given your technical backgrounds, it can be easy to lose sight of the fact that your biggest assets are your imagination and your ability to persuade people to see your vision of the future. It may seem surprising, but the best ideas don't automatically rise to the top and gain adoption. Every new idea or invention threatens the existing status quo, and you can bet that a lot of people are working very hard to protect the status quo. The inertia that you encounter will be overwhelmingly frustrating at times, but never give up. Even good ideas especially good ideas, need advocates. And if you don't consider yourself a persuasive person, acquiring the skill as soon as possible is the single most important thing that you can do to position yourself for success. The last thing that I want to urge you to do is to only work on really big problems. The tools that you have available today are unprecedented, and there's no shortage of problems that need to be solved. Curing genetic disease, mastering immunotherapy, developing drugs for mental health and dementia, addressing antibiotic resistance, obesity, nuclear proliferation, human rights, privacy, poverty, water security, renewable energy, and even problems that haven't yet occurred, but will probably soon, like loss of encryption based on prime factorization, on which our entire financial system depends, and technological advances rendering large segments of the human workforce obsolete. Solving big problems requires resources, and the beauty of big problems is that it's much easier to get funding for them, whether in academia or business. When there's a large market that can pay for the solution, that funding can come from investors, like venture capitalists. When the beneficiaries of your solution are delocalized or are simply unable to pay for it, that funding can come from government or philanthropists. But at the end of the day, someone will always pay to solve big problems, so you'll always be able to get the resources that you need. The other nice thing about big problems is that there's absolutely no shame in failure, and ruling out possible solutions that don't work go a long way toward identifying a solution that does. So if you do nothing else, work on big problems and always swing for the fences. I want you to save the smaller problems for our friends at Oklahoma State and Texas A&M, purely as a courtesy. Family members, thank you for the support that you've given these graduates. Graduates, you should be very proud of what you've accomplished, and I congratulate you. Celebrate your achievements, take some time to relax and do the things that you enjoy, and then get back to work. Finally, as you go forward, never forget that what starts here changes the world. Thank you.